Hey everyone, great to see you. Thanks for joining me for a few minutes today. So yeah, DX, we have a platform where we help organizations understand developer experience and the knock-on effects of developer productivity. But obviously over the last year-ish, a little more than that, we've had people wondering just what is the impact of AI on the productivity of their organizations. And so we have a really broad set of data. And so every quarter we release reports that kind of sum up kind of what we've seen across the industry. So this quarter's report was a very strong signal. We looked at signals from over 190,000 engineers across over 400 companies. And so I'm going to kind of just show you some of the broader trends that we were able to see. So here's the methodology again, 460 plus companies with engineering org sizes ranging from like less than 50 engineers to over 10,000 engineers. So we really looked at a broad set of firmographics here as well, with companies that were headquartered across North America, LATAM, Europe, and Asia Pacific. And yeah, over 190,000 engineers showed up in this study. If you'd like to download the full report, this is an ungated link. We won't make you put in all your private info or anything like that. You can go have a look at the report there too. And we also have a lot of this information at our booth, which is right outside stage one. So if you take a left right as you leave this talk, you'll find our booth. We have some other printed reports and research and stuff like that as well. So. All right, so let's take a look then at what we're seeing in terms of the current impact of AI. And again, this is information just from the last quarter's worth of data, so we look at every 3 months. So this data is good as of about the end of March. So we got through that critical November, December 2025 period where we saw crazy leaps in the models. I've definitely spoken with people who are like, I don't even want to look at data from before November of 2024. It doesn't count, or 2025, it doesn't count because of those changes, but this is post all of that. And what we've seen first is that we've seen adoption. This is coming from API telemetry metrics specifically, hit about 93%. Now, what's really interesting is that in that remaining 7% cohort, we still saw AI-generated code and AI time savings. So shadow AI is definitely happening too. This is where we're seeing AI-generated code make its way into production, get merged in, but no record of telemetry from those users actually using the enterprise account. So we'll get into that a little bit further, but something to be aware of. I think this number is much higher than 93%. This was up from about 90% 3 months ago. So we're seeing that last 10% kind of make its way. We're seeing regular, which we read as daily users, saving about 4.7 hours a week. This is a qualitative metric, but again, gathered at a rate of 190,000 engineers. So that's a pretty strong signal. And we see this nice sort of satisfying graph here where more regular users, which you see on the left of the graph here, kind of moving down to then like weekly, monthly users. So we see more time savings from folks who are using the tools regularly. And that's to be expected, right? There is an absolute learning curve, a J curve with this technology, just like any other type of technology. We absolutely saw across every firmographic and every demographic, a year or so ago, moving from more experimental and lighter adoption to more regular adoption, we saw productivity metrics and quality metrics go down across the board, no exceptions, every firmographic, every demographic. And then as that utilization ticked up a little bit more, we saw that curve kind of correct, and then we absolutely see regular users outperforming in terms of like basic productivity metrics like PR velocity and things like that, peers who are not taking advantage of the technology. But no surprise here that we see more regular users actually saving more time. I just think that that's part of the learning curve. We're seeing on average, and our highest users were hitting more over 30%, of 27.4% of merged code. So code actually making it into production is AI authored code. We're looking in two ways to gather this data. We do have now, as of a few months ago, an actual daemon that we have some of our clients running locally on workstations that can take a look at things like file system level heuristics and actually make hooks into the frontier model APIs to determine how much of the code that's actually coming off of that workstation is AI generated, and then tracing it all the way to production, as well as qualitative signals as well, so self-reported signals. So it's a blend of both of those that we got to come to this number. That daily use at 30% is up 8% just from the Q4 2025 report. So we saw almost a 30% increase just over that 3-month period, which I think is kind of interesting. And I think we'll continue to see those trends kind of go up. As we're getting better gating, better validation loops, and more autonomous processes that are run specifically by agents, I think we'll see more and more merged code make its way into production that's AI generated. This is where I mentioned that we see the more regular users sort of outperforming some of their peers. We do see that daily users are shipping 60% more PRs. Now, PR throughput is not a perfect metric for productivity, obviously, but it is a decent proxy metric, a directional metric for figuring out who's kind of getting more into production. It doesn't cover value, it doesn't cover what's necessarily in that PR, although I should say that we do look at weighted throughput. So we do have a small ML. Remember ML before deep learning? This is a small ML model actually looking at the changes that make their way through those PRs to try to determine, was this like a one-line change to a README file, or was this like actually adding a new feature? So we do weight this when we look at this. And we do see more regular users of AI are shipping more PRs than their peers who are not using the technology as frequently. In this case, we see about a 60% increase there. Now, what about quality? All right, well, this is a nuanced story. What you're looking at right here is an average, right? We're looking at average from lower users or no users showing up in telemetry to more regular users showing up at the telemetry, and we're looking at a qualitative metric called change confidence. And this is a qualitative metric of how confident an engineer feels in making changes, putting stuff into production without breaking things, okay? And what we see is a 2.6% average gain from using AI. This is scored on what's called a top box Likert scale. So if you're familiar with gathering qualitative metrics, you might ask a survey question, and then the possible answers are like always, very often, sometimes, right? The percentage of people who answer always and very often is called the top box score, and that scale is called a Likert scale. So this is how this is scored. So this means that we saw a 2.6% more positive response from regular AI users than non-users when we looked on average in change confidence. Okay, modest but positively leaning. We saw the same thing with code maintainability, right? So when I'm looking at the code in front of me, like how confident do I feel changing this? How easily can I sort of recognize what's going on in this code? 2.2% average gain. Okay, again, heading in the right direction, but very, very modest. Very similar with change failure rate, too. This is the DORA change failure rate quality metric. We saw a 0.11% reduction. Of course, you want that number to go down, which doesn't sound like much until you realize that the industry benchmark for change failure rate is around 4%. All right, so that 0.11% is a little bit more significant. But again, modest, but positively leaning. So we looked at this data, we're like, this can't be right. Because we're talking to engineering organizations that feel really good about where quality is headed, or at least they don't feel scared, right? But we talk to other organizations that are either not sure about their quality metrics, or they're concerned that quality is actually going down. So we thought, well, what would happen if we broke this same data out per company? And here is what we saw. Every bar on that graph represents a single company. Look at the volatility there. Okay? This is change confidence again. We see some people going up as much as 20%, others going down as much as 20%. Right? So these averages, that average filter, kind of flattens the actual reality of the data, which is that there's still a lot of volatility and still an uneven distribution in terms of ROI from this tech. We looked at the same thing with code maintainability, and we saw the same results per company again. Now, of course, this isn't pure causation, right? There's other stuff that's going to cause this to happen. I think we all know at this point that AI is an accelerant of both good and bad practice, but I think it really bears mentioning that when it comes to quality, which is what we really care about, speed and quality, right? We still see all of this volatility. So this is code maintainability. Here's change failure rate. Some folks going, you want to be on the bottom side of this graph. Some people going up as much as 2%, which again, against that industry benchmark of 4%, could mean shipping as much as 50% more defects than before, all right? So really important to measure, really important to understand, where you are on this spectrum. All right, let's look at some trends. This one doesn't surprise me too much. I've been writing code professionally since the late 90s, all right? So I'm a bit of a OG developer at this point, I guess. And I think like a lot of us who have been in the industry this long, it took a little while to unlearn a few things about our workflows and learn some new muscle around this technology. So it took me a little longer to latch onto this stuff. Junior devs, though, no problem, right? I mean, they don't have much to unlearn. They're more willing to adopt new things, and I think that's always been that way in kind of every hype cycle. So we do see, in terms of showing up in the telemetry, junior engineers using the tech, using AI actually the most. Interestingly, though, when we start breaking down particular use cases and we start cross-referencing that to token usage, we do see staff engineers approaching the same use case using significantly less tokens than more junior engineers who are approaching the same use case, which again, not too surprising, right? I think with a more senior engineer, the prompting is going to be a little bit more focused, right? There's going to be a better maybe recognition of what's wrong with some of the outputs, whereas I think more junior engineers may need a little bit more of that feedback and going back and forth sort of conversationally with the assistant or with the agent. We're seeing and as a result, we're seeing staff engineers, so very senior engineers and junior engineers actually saving the most time. This was a shift from the last report. The last report actually showed junior engineers, staff engineers also saving the most time. Now junior engineers have caught up to that, right? Which again, I think this is the learning curve in play here, right? Just more time spent with this technology. This one really surprised us. We had to look at this data several times to make sure that we hadn't missed something here. Traditional enterprises seem to have the highest daily AI usage, the highest adoption, which is counterintuitive to what we usually see. But then we really started thinking about this, and we formulated a hypothesis that basically we know that structured rollouts of AI are very positively associated with good adoption and more successful outcomes with AI. And this is sort of baked into the DNA of traditional enterprises, right? They're used to doing structured rollouts of new technology. So it may have taken traditional enterprises a little bit longer to get here, but now we actually see them outpacing other types of businesses in terms of overall utilization, which we found really interesting. We really had to kind of triple take that because we're like, what's going on here? But I think that's our hypothesis now, is that we do know that a good structured rollout is very positively associated with success, and that traditional enterprises, this is just what we do with every new bit of tech, is a more structured rollout. Larger companies are using AI more frequently. So that's this third bar here. These are organizations with engineering sizes of 1,000 to 5,000 engineers. And we see more frequent use there too. And I think, again, this just comes down to that more structured rollout capability that we tend to see with larger organizations. Larger companies have, I think, just bigger opportunities for accelerating this use kind of within the organization. But smaller companies are still leading in overall time savings, despite that adoption being a little bit different. This is just because of less friction in the actual release, right? I mean, I think with larger scaled organizations, the platforms are a little bit more complicated. There are more gates that we have to jump through, whereas smaller organizations can be a little bit more agile in terms of getting that code from workstation out to production. So we do see smaller companies sort of outpacing in terms of the overall time savings. And as I mentioned before, we really can't ignore shadow AI. What you're seeing here is this rightmost column is a percentage of merged code into production that's generated by AI, but that rightmost column are also engineers that are not showing up in the API telemetry. Okay, so for our enterprise license or the licenses that we're distributing out to our engineers, they're not showing up in the actual API, but merged code is coming from them that is AI generated. We saw shadow IT, we saw shadow cloud. I mean, this happens at every major hype cycle. I just think we need to, especially as engineering leaders, try to get to the heart of okay, why? Why are people using personal accounts as opposed to the enterprise licenses? Are we offering the wrong tool? Are we not offering enough enablement on that tool? Is there not enough variety in the tools that are being offered? What's the root of that? Because this is a problem, right? I mean, this is opening up multiple new potential attack surfaces, as well as sources of data leaks, right? We don't know what's going on when people are using their personal licenses, where we do have the ability to run our enterprise licenses and things like that through LLM gateways and some of these new technologies that are emerging to help us use AI more securely. So we really can't ignore this problem. We need to start thinking about, what could we be doing differently as leaders to encourage people to use the licenses that are being provided for them by the organization. We see newer tools delivering more gains in terms of velocity. We see Claude and Cursor sort of leading the pack here in terms of PR throughput impact. And that's just, the first mover advantage is always good in some ways, but the pace at which these models are improving and the pace at which the tech is improving, means that I think the newer players are going to have more of an advantage and that they don't have to deal with sort of the legacy debt, even though we're talking about like a year, versus newer players in the market. So yeah, we see Claude and Cursor providing the most productivity benefit, looking at weighted PR throughput as the metric there. This one's really interesting. AI is delivering bigger gains in more modern languages. I don't think that should be surprising for anybody. But look at that leftmost column. That's Rust. Okay? Rust was behind Golang in the Q4 2025 report, and Golang was leading the way there. So why is Rust all of a sudden surging ahead? If you look at the change logs, if you look at some of the more distinct changes that were made to the models over the last quarter, there were specific bugs around the Rust language. It was hallucinating specific things like lifecycle problems and async issues and stuff like that, specifically for Rust. Those bugs were fixed over the last quarter, and we're actually seeing this in the data now. If you think about it, if you know much about Rust, Rust is like ideal for doing any type of agentic or AI work because it provides a ton of data and telemetry during the build process, which can be used as context for the agents that are generating code against the Rust language. So it's actually quite ideal. It was just that there were these very specific bugs that were making it more difficult to work with Rust using these models, and those bugs were addressed and fixed. And now we see, like just in the last 3 months, Rust really surging ahead. I found this to be really, really interesting. This is another one where we had to double check the data because we were like, that seems a little too anomalous. Like, yeah, sure, Rust should be at the at the head of this, or should be high in this list, but not necessarily this high. But then we looked at when these specific changes were made, and we saw this direct impact to how Rust is performing. So I think really underscores improvements in these models can have very material effects, and even specific effects, like making it easier and more efficient to generate Rust code. This one's interesting too. Obviously, this isn't the full causation, but we've seen this big impact on overall ramp up, on onboarding of new engineers into new teams, going from over 80 days back in mid-2024 to now about 33 days in the last report, so more than cut in half. And there's multiple angles where AI could really be assisting with this, right? I mean, first of all, improving the documentation, but also making the documentation more accessible, but also making it easier to understand the code that's in front of you, right? I mean, code explanation is a great use case for AI. So I think there's multiple areas where AI has contributed to this, but I don't think we can ignore that within that same sort of very critical period for AI adoption over the last year and a half, we've seen engineering onboarding go from over 80 days to now just over 30 days, so more than cut in half. So pretty interesting there. Engineering managers are shipping 4 times as much code as they were 6 months ago. I see some interesting reactions to that one. The implications there. I'm an optimist, all right? I like to look at this as engineers are now going to be able to recover that sort of player-coach mentality that we had during the days of DevOps, right? And why is that important? Well, as a developer, if we agree that developer experience is a leading indicator for developer productivity, and that developer experience is more of a systems problem than a people problem, then the systems matter, right? And when an engineer has been saying for years, oh my, our build times are an hour, this causes a bunch of context switching, we should do something about this, and engineering managers are like, oh, I don't know. Now engineering managers are shipping code, and they're like, our build times take an hour, we should do something about this. So I tend to think positively about that one. That engineering managers having a better idea of the ground truth of the organization can only help developer experience in general, but there's many ways to interpret that data. This one's interesting too. 75% of designers and product managers are also using AI code assistants. This isn't just Lovable and Figma, This is actually designers and PMs showing up in the API telemetry for tools like Claude and Cursor. All right, so this has really got to, we have to start rethinking, like, how do we want to position our teams? How can we take advantage of this? How can we make less friction in the handoff between our PMs and designers and the actual engineers? What can we do to take advantage of this to reduce some of that friction, right? We know that this can be a problem, like, you know, coming up with a great PRD that's not necessarily written in the language of engineers can lead to some friction in the handoff. How can we take advantage of this moment to make that easier? How can we reposition our teams to keep design and PM closer in the loop with engineers? And how can we think about the, quote, developer experience of our designers and PMs now that they're a little bit closer to the code, right? Again, 75%, 3/4, we found in the API telemetry. This is not a qualitative metric. This is a hard system metric. Now, a lot of that's pretty optimistic. You can see the full details of this report in our booth. We have a printed copy of this. This is a long-term longitudinal study that we did on the impact to weighted PR throughput over a 16-month period. So this was November of 2024 to late February of this year. We wanted to see, associated with a good spike in adoption of various AI tools, what is that actually doing to weighted PR throughput? And here's what we found. We took a random sample from over 400 companies. We knew anecdotally that some of these companies were doing things like incentivizing PR throughput, which is not a great idea. It can be sort of gamified if you're familiar with Goodhart's law. So we've filtered those companies out. We looked for companies that had recently gone through M&As, IPOs, any type of strong regulatory changes. We filtered them out too because we knew that that could affect PR throughput. And so it was as pure of a data set as we could come up with. We found a median P50 overall increase of 7.76% and a mean average of 13%, which of course means that there were some outliers up at the top in that P90 range that performed a little bit better. Our top performer in this study hit 70%. Okay, that's not 2x, that's not 5. Now, first of all, you remember when we would have celebrated a 10% improvement? Like, that would sound great. But now that we're given, you know, all of this, oh no, 5x, 10x, like we're not seeing it. We're not seeing it in the data. And there's a few reasons for this, right? I mean, first of all, depending on which study you look at, 14% of an engineer's time is spent writing, 16%, somewhere in there is the amount of time that engineers actually get to sit down and write code, which means that even if we had instant models that were 100% accurate, neither of which is true, we still would only be attacking around 14 to 16% of the problem. So that's one takeaway here, is that there's other opportunities throughout the SDLC and PDLC, which we'll look at momentarily. The other is that if this is what you're seeing, like, you're okay. Like, you haven't missed the boat. This is kind of what the industry is seeing right now. We also know that non-AI factors are greatly outweighing the benefits of AI. This pale line in the middle is time savings from AI. But we're seeing this still eclipsed by, like, meeting heavy days, other sources of context switching, the cumulative effects of the dev environment. So we want to look beyond code generation, and that's what we're going to close with here. As Ellie Goldratt, who invented theory of constraints, was famous for saying, an hour saved on something that isn't the bottleneck is worthless. So what else could we be looking at? Well, I think there's a new mandate for platform engineering teams. We need to drive better AI readiness. We need data-driven AI rollouts. We need to measure for impact and value, not just activity and speed. And we need to create constraints by creating pay paths and guardrails and optimize for cost. This AI readiness is pretty interesting. We want clear, accurate, well-structured documentation for agents to work well across the SDLC. We want straightforward data structures, readable modular code, fast, reliable local CI, and stable, non-flaky test sets. And if any of this sounds familiar, it's because we used to just call this good DevX. But it turns out that what's good for developers is also good for agents. And then we want to improve our context and then find the bottleneck and fix the bottleneck. And we see lots of companies doing this. Morgan Stanley built DevGen AI, which is a legacy code refactor agent. It looks at legacy code and context and builds very friendly developer specifications that can be handed right to engineers so that they can then rewrite that logic in a more modern framework. And they're saving about 280,000 hours annually with this. Zapier is one of my favorite stories right now with AI. They've built this whole ecosystem. They can onboard new agents within just a couple of days into production. They're seeing anywhere from 15 to 20% better productivity out of any single engineer by limiting stand-ups to only twice a week. and reducing onboarding to actually 2 weeks for a new engineer, which is also very impressive. My favorite part is that they are hiring more than they ever have in the history of their whole company, because they know that they're getting more value out of any single engineer, and they want to live in a world where there is no backlog, and we can deal with customer feedback immediately and fix bugs immediately. That's the right attitude, right? This is an increased capacity play, and I believe that this will ultimately induce the demand for more engineers across the industry. I think Zapier is setting a great example here. Canva has natural language prompting, where PMs and designers can now get requirements into the system using natural language prompts very quickly, but also generate very developer-friendly PRDs so that they can be handed off easily with little friction. Fair has built an automated code review agent that provides immediate feedback about the change directly in the PR comments and can get that feedback to engineers quickly, which will then be read by the human person who's going to review that code later. There needs to be a human in the loop. It's just taking care of some superficial things here, all of which will be documented in the PR, which is handy for the human reviewer. And finally, Spotify. If you remember the Spotify model, that was like the North Star for DevOps for a long time. They're calling this Spotify 2.0 now, agentic PDLC at Spotify. They have SREs that are now assisted by agents when an incident occurs. An agent goes and gathers a bunch of context and information on the incident, remediation steps from the runbooks, and posts that directly into SRE Slack channels so that they can have those critical few minutes of discovery are handled by an agent. It also means tapping engineers on the shoulder less often to help with incidents. And that is all I have for you today. It says Q&A. We don't have time for that, but come and find us in the booth. And thanks so much for your time. Appreciate it.